They laughed at her accent. Then she opened a ledger and ended their careers in 2 sentences. See the moment the board rises for the cleaner who saves the company and names the thieves. The scent of lemon polish lingered in the air as Isabella Cruz bent over the long oak table, her hands moving in steady circles that left the surface shining. The office was silent, except for the hum of the air conditioner, and she kept her eyes down, focusing on each mark until it disappeared. She was used to silence, used to being invisible, and it gave her time to think. At 24, she had already worked more jobs than most people, twice her age, and now she found herself cleaning the offices of people who made more in a day than she would in a year. She tightened her ponytail, shifted the cleaning cloth in her hand, and kept her posture straight even though her back ached from hours of bending. The click of expensive shoes broke her rhythm, followed by voices that carried the sharp tone of authority. A group of managers entered, led by Derek Harlow, the vice president of finance. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his suit pressed to perfection, his gold watch flashing under the lights. Everyone knew his reputation. He was feared in meetings, ruthless with numbers, and cruel with people. Isabella glanced at the floor, hoping to pass unnoticed. But Derek's eyes fell on her, and a smirk tugged at his lips. He slowed his pace, tilting his head as if studying an amusing spectacle. "Well, look at this," he said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the other managers. "Maybe the new cleaner can balance the books with that mop." Laughter erupted around him, the kind of laughter that fed off his power, not because the joke was funny, but because no one dared to stay silent. Isabella's cheeks warmed, but she kept her eyes on the table, moving her cloth as if the words had not reached her. "Careful with that polish," Derek added, drawing closer. "Wouldn't want you to smear the figures, though I'm sure numbers aren't your specialty." More chuckles followed, softer but still sharp. Isabella pressed the cloth harder against the wood, her fingers whitening with the strain. She had been mocked before, in school when her accent slipped, in shops when her uniform gave away her status. But here, it cut deeper. This was the world she once dreamed of joining, the world she had studied for, the world that now laughed at her as if she were less than human. She forced herself to breathe slowly, refusing to let her hands tremble. Derek soon lost interest, turning back to his managers, their polished shoes clicking across the marble floor as they carried on with their meeting. Their voices drifted down the hall, leaving her in silence once more. Isabella straightened, her reflection faintly visible in the polished table. The girl who looked back at her was not weak, not broken, though they wanted her to feel that way. She touched the edge of her father's worn leather ledger hidden in her bag, its weight a reminder of who she was and what she knew. Numbers had always been her language, and no amount of laughter could erase that truth. For now she remained quiet. The invisible cleaner mocked for her accent and her uniform, but inside a spark had been lit, and Derek Harlow had just struck the match. Isabella moved quietly through the long corridors, her cart rolling beside her with the faint squeak of worn wheels. The offices smelled of coffee and printer ink, the lingering trace of perfume from executives who had left hours before still floating in the air. She kept her phone tucked between bottles of polish and stacks of rags, its screen glowing faintly as the recorder ran. Every word from the meeting carried through the thin glass walls, voices rising and falling as charts flickered on the large screen inside. The managers thought she was deaf to their language, but numbers were a world she had once ruled with ease, and every projection, every balance sheet, every whispered concern slid into her memory as neatly as lines in her father's ledger. She bent to wipe down a table, eyes downcast, but her ears sharp. She remembered a time when she sat in lecture halls, her hand moving faster than her professors could talk, solving equations before the rest of the class had even lifted their pens. At 18, she had been called a prodigy, the kind of student professors wrote letters about, the kind of student who could have graduated early and gone on to reshape financial systems. Her dream was simple: to become a certified accountant, to manage not only numbers but people's lives through the fairness of balance sheets and budgets. Her father's illness ended that dream almost overnight. The medical bills climbed like vines, suffocating every other expense. Tuition notices arrived, then late fees, then the final letter that left her no choice but to leave college and take whatever job could put food on the table. Her father's voice still lingered, even after his passing. "Numbers do not lie," he used to say, holding up his leather ledger. "People may twist them, people may bury them under tricks and excuses, but the truth waits inside the math." When Isabella looked at the glowing screen through the conference glass, she saw not just numbers, but stories, hidden truths they thought invisible. The managers muttered about quarterly losses and supply chain costs, but she noticed the inflated expenses, the mismatched figures, the quiet inconsistencies that no one inside dared to question. She pressed the cloth into the wood grain of a desk, her hands steady, her mind racing. The recorder captured everything. The tone of Derek's voice as he brushed off concerns, the way others nodded without argument. Isabella's phone was cheap and old, bought secondhand, but it was her lifeline, storing the words she could later transcribe into careful notes. Every late night after her shift, she would sit at the small kitchen table beside her mother, translating those voices into columns of figures, aligning them against what she knew to be right. It was her hidden talent, invisible yet powerful, her way of keeping sharp the mind that once solved puzzles no one else dared to try. She knew it was dangerous, but as she watched those executives bluff through figures they barely understood, she also knew it was necessary. Her mop might make her invisible to them, but her mind made her dangerous, and someday they would realize too late that the girl they mocked could see everything. The leather felt smooth under Isabella's fingertips as she pulled the ledger from her bag, the edges worn soft from years of her father's use. It was not just a book filled with numbers, it was a piece of him that she carried everywhere, a weight that reminded her of nights when the world had been steady and her future certain. Her father had been a quiet man with sharp eyes and steady hands, a man who believed that order could be found in balance sheets the same way sailors once found direction in the stars. He used to sit at their kitchen table with the ledger open before him, pencil moving in neat lines as he tracked every expense with precision. "Numbers don't lie," he would always say, and she had learned to believe him. People might bend truth with words, but math told the story that could not be hidden. She had grown up listening to the scratch of his pencil while her mother cooked. The smell of rice and beans filling their small apartment. The sound of pages turning like the steady rhythm of a clock. He taught her how to add without using her fingers, how to find mistakes hidden inside stacks of receipts, how to predict the outcome of a budget before anyone else noticed the pattern. The ledger had been his most trusted tool, and on her 16th birthday, after hours of coughing fits that left his body weak, he had pressed it into her hands with a smile that broke her heart. "This is yours now," he said, every figure neat and exact as he closed it for the last time. "Use it well, because numbers never lie." When the hospital bills came faster than they could pay, when late notices piled up on the counter, Isabella turned to that ledger like a compass. She learned to stretch every dollar the way her father had shown her, to make groceries last a week longer than they should, to keep the electricity on by balancing which bills could wait and which could not. The ledger became more than paper and ink. It became survival, and when he was gone, when his voice was only an echo in her mind, it became her inheritance, the only treasure he could leave behind. Now, every night after she returned from work, she opened its pages, running her hand over the columns filled with neat figures and tidy margins. She added her own entries in the spaces he had left blank, her handwriting smaller and sharper, but guided by his same discipline. Rent, medicine, utilities, groceries, everything noted with the same seriousness he once gave to company contracts. She had even begun filling the back pages with the numbers she overheard at work, copying projections and percentages, using the ledger to balance what the managers refused to see. It was her secret weapon, her proof that she was more than a girl with a mop. As long as she had the ledger, she had direction, she had her father's voice reminding her that truth was written in the math, and she had the strength to face a world that wanted to keep her small. The building was nearly empty, the silence broken only by the steady hum of lights and the soft squeak of Isabella's cart as she pushed it along the polished floor. She liked these hours. when the corridors were deserted and the city outside glowed faintly through the glass walls. Tonight, though, the quiet was cut short. As she neared the executive wing, voices rose sharp and tense, carrying through the partly open door of the conference room. She slowed her pace, pulling the cart to the side, cloth still in her hand as if she were working, though her ears leaned closer to the noise. Inside, the executives sat scattered around the long table, ties loosened, jackets tossed carelessly over chairs, their faces pale with worry. Derek Harlow stood at the head, waving papers like a man drowning. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced with panic. 50 million, he snapped, slamming a hand on the table. We are short 50 million, and the investors will know it by the end of the week. A murmur of disbelief spread through the room, managers flipping through reports, some whispering to one another, others burying their faces in their hands. Isabella felt her heart quicken as she gripped the mop handle tighter. 50 million, she repeated silently, the number ringing like a bell in her head. One of the executives argued that it had to be a mistake, that the reports would prove solid if checked again. Another insisted that the supply chain delays had thrown off projections. Derek cut them all off with a snarl. Investors are demanding answers in 72 hours. If we cannot produce a solution, we will be finished. Bankruptcy hearings, stock collapse, all of it. The room fell silent after that, the weight of his words pressing down like heavy air. Isabella glanced at the stack of papers visible from where she stood. Even at a distance she could see mismatched columns, figures that did not align, totals that bled into losses disguised as gains. To anyone else it was noise, but to her it was a language she had spent her life learning. She bent to wipe the glass case outside the room, careful to keep her posture calm, though every word seeped into her memory. One manager suggested cutting staff again, murmuring about trimming wages to buy time, but Derek shook his head. Too obvious. We need something cleaner, something that looks like growth, not desperation. Isabella felt her stomach turn. She knew what growth should look like. She had studied it in textbooks and written about it in exams, and nothing she overheard resembled truth. It was patchwork, smoke and mirrors, men scrambling to protect themselves while the foundation cracked beneath them. Her phone, hidden in the cart, recorded every word. Later, at home, she would listen again, writing figures into her father's ledger, aligning them against the logic he had taught her. But in that moment she only listened, her breath shallow, her hands moving in circles across the polished glass. The laughter from days before echoed in her memory, their mockery still stinging, yet tonight their power felt weaker. They were men pretending to command numbers, but she knew the truth. She knew that 50 million did not vanish by chance. Reports did not add up for a reason, and while they panicked inside, she quietly absorbed every detail, invisible, yet already holding the thread that could unravel their entire crisis. The next evening, Isabella moved carefully between rows of chairs, her cloth sweeping dust from the edges of the conference table, while the executives gathered for yet another emergency meeting. Their voices carried the same tension as the night before, clipped and sharp, filled with numbers that refused to cooperate no matter how they twisted them. Derek stood at the front of the room, marker in hand, scribbling figures onto the whiteboard in a frenzy. The columns sprawled in uneven lines, half erased, half rewritten, as if chaos itself had taken form on the surface. Isabella kept her eyes down, but her mind traced every digit, seeing the mismatches, the incorrect totals. The way one column ended at 39.2, yet was rounded into 45, as if no one would notice. She noticed, every detail slipping into her memory with painful clarity. The board members sat restless, their polished shoes tapping against the floor, their phones buzzing with unanswered calls from investors. Derek's tie was loose, his sleeves rolled, his expression somewhere between anger and exhaustion. He slammed the marker down and turned suddenly, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on Isabella near the edge of the table. A cruel smile crept across his face, and she felt the heat of his stare even as she focused on the wood grain under her cloth. "Maybe," he said, raising his voice so all could hear, "maybe the cleaner can find the missing millions for us." Laughter burst across the room, sharp and cruel, feeding off his power. Some laughed nervously, others too loudly, but every sound struck Isabella like stones. She tightened her grip on the cloth, forcing her face to remain calm, though inside, her chest burned. She continued wiping the same spot, though it no longer held a trace of dust, the sound of their laughter pressing against her ears. Derek gestured toward her with a mocking flourish. She spends enough time around our numbers. Maybe she understands them better than the analysts. Another round of laughter followed, but Isabella kept her eyes down, though the truth was that she did understand them better. The board members saw a cleaner with tired hands, but her mind was already racing through the mistakes Derek had written on the board. A missing decimal here, an overstated projection there, assumptions about revenue growth that had no foundation. They called it a shortfall, but Isabella could see the cracks that made up that hole, each one caused not by chance, but by careless manipulation. She wanted to speak, to point out the errors as easily as she could polish the wood, but she pressed her lips together. To reveal herself now would be to step into their world without protection, to hand them her secret with no way to defend it. Instead, she bent lower, her reflection faint in the shine of the table, and let their laughter roll past her like waves. She noted the numbers in her mind, every error etched beside the memory of Derek's voice, every lie marked with precision. He thought his joke would humiliate her, but it had only handed her proof that their empire was built on illusions. She continued to move silently, invisible to them, yet holding the truth they could not see, a truth that waited like a storm just beyond the horizon. The office was dark when Isabella wheeled her cart down the silent hall, the glow of the city spilling through the tall windows like scattered stars. She knew the guards by name now, and they barely glanced at her as she passed, their nods casual, their trust unquestioning. To them she was just another cleaner working overtime, nothing worth a second look. That invisibility had once cut her like a blade, but tonight it was her shield, the cover she needed to move unseen. She paused at the door of the empty conference room, the faint smell of markers still lingering in the air, the whiteboard crowded with half-erased figures from earlier meetings. The numbers were wrong. She could see it from the doorway, but no one in that room had noticed. She set her cart against the wall, reached into her bag, and pulled out the leather ledger, its worn cover soft against her hands, its pages already filled with her own careful notes. She sat at the edge of the long table, flipping to a clean page, her pencil moving with steady confidence. She transcribed the figures exactly as they appeared on the board, then began adjusting them, balancing columns, correcting misplaced decimals, exposing the hidden gaps they had either overlooked or ignored. It was the same rhythm she had learned from her father, each calculation a truth waiting to be uncovered. Within minutes, the chaos on the board became order on the page, the false totals giving way to reality. The shortfall was still there, but now it was no longer a mystery, the cracks clear enough for anyone willing to look. She opened her phone, logging into an old account she had once created to tutor classmates online. The username had been chosen in a hurry, but it felt fitting now. Night Owl. She typed quickly, uploading clean charts and corrected formulas, posting them to the shared company drive that executives accessed during their frantic attempts to solve the crisis. She left no name, no trace, only the quiet mark of her pseudonym in the corner of each file. It was a whisper, a ghost leaving behind truth in a place where lies had lived unchecked. Her hands trembled slightly as she saved the final document, the ledger open beside her, its margins filled with small notes in her father's handwriting. She imagined him watching, nodding, reminding her that numbers never lied, that her skill was not a burden but a gift. She packed quickly, erasing her presence from the room as carefully as she had polished the tables, leaving behind only the work. Tomorrow, the executives would open their files and find corrections waiting, corrections that pointed to gaps they had missed, corrections that someone among them would try to claim. But that did not matter yet. What mattered was that she had stepped into the fight, even if only from the shadows. She was still invisible to their eyes, but not to their numbers, not to the truth. As she closed the ledger and slid it back into her bag, she whispered the name to herself. Night Owl. It felt like more than a username. It felt like a promise, one that the men who laughed at her would soon come to understand. Morning light spilled across the polished floors as Isabella moved her cart through the executive wing, her uniform crisp, though her eyes showed the weight of another sleepless night. The conference room buzzed with energy. Executives gathered early, voices louder than usual, tension replaced with sudden confidence. She paused just outside the glass wall, cloth in hand, and listened as Derek Harlow stood at the whiteboard with the swagger of a man who believed himself untouchable. The figures looked familiar because they were hers, neat corrections she had uploaded under the name Night Owl. Yet Derek pointed to them as if they had come from his own mind, his voice smooth and commanding, each word designed to win approval. "These adjustments were my idea," he said, tapping a marker against the balanced columns. "I stayed up late, couldn't shake the numbers from my head, and it struck me where we had gone wrong. Simple, really, if you have the right instincts." A ripple of admiration spread across the table. One executive clapped him on the back, another nodded, as if grateful for his brilliance. The CEO himself leaned forward, interest clear in his sharp eyes. "Finally," he muttered, "someone who can clean up this mess." The room erupted in relieved laughter, not the cruel kind Isabella had endured, but the kind that celebrated survival. Her grip tightened on the cloth, knuckles pale. She had known this would happen, had known the risk of leaving her work unsigned. Still, hearing him claim what was not his burned hotter than she expected. She watched as he drew arrows across the board, explaining corrections he could not possibly understand, yet his confidence was so practiced, so convincing, that no one questioned him. He stole not just her work, but her chance to prove herself. Her hours bent over the ledger, her father's teachings turned into his performance. She lowered her gaze quickly when Derek's eyes flicked toward the door, but he barely noticed her, too caught in the glory of his moment. The CEO shook his hand firmly, declaring him the lead on the crisis team, praising his initiative, promising bonuses once investors were calmed. Isabella's heart pounded as fury spread through her chest, sharp and heavy. She wanted to step forward, to shout the truth, to lay the ledger open on the table and expose him. But her voice stayed locked in her throat, her father's words echoing. "Numbers do not lie," he had always said. But people did. And those lies could swallow truth if spoken too soon. She turned away, pushing her cart down the hall, her movements steady though her thoughts burned. She could not reveal herself now, not without proof stronger than balanced columns, not without risking everything. Yet she promised herself one thing as she wiped down the glass doors, her reflection staring back with steady eyes. She would not stay silent forever. Fury was no longer a wound but a weapon, and she would sharpen it carefully until the time came to strike. The office grew quiet after midnight, the hum of machines, the only sound, as Isabella moved slowly through the executive floor. Her cart rolled beside her, its wheels whispering across marble, her hands steady, though her thoughts still boiled with the memory of Derek standing at the whiteboard, stealing credit for work that was never his. She had told herself to wait, to keep calm, but waiting did not ease the fury that burned in her chest. Tonight, she polished desks and emptied bins as always, but her eyes scanned the papers left carelessly on tables, the files stacked half open on desks. She knew the executives treated her as invisible, and that invisibility gave her freedom they did not realize. In Derek's office, she found the first clue. A folder sat on the corner of his desk, its cover marked with a supplier's name she had never heard before. She flipped it open quickly, ready to close it at the slightest sound, but what she saw made her freeze. The invoices were for equipment purchases that didn't match any project she had overheard, contracts signed with companies that seemed unfamiliar. The amounts were enormous, lines of figures that made no sense compared with the company's real needs. She pulled out her phone, the camera clicking softly as she photographed each page. Her pulse quickened, but she moved fast, sliding papers back exactly as she had found them. The next office revealed more. 2 managers she had seen laughing alongside Derek were listed as contacts on additional contracts. Different company names, same inflated numbers, all pointing to money flowing out of the firm into places it was not meant to go. Isabella's training, half forgotten during years of scrubbing floors, returned with force. She saw the patterns in an instant, the repetition of addresses, the matching signatures, the numbers that rounded too neatly. These were shell companies, hollow names designed to hold money while the real men behind them grew richer. The shortfall wasn't an accident at all. It was theft, hidden in plain sight, hidden beneath the chaos Derek pretended to clean up. Her hand shook as she snapped photo after photo. Each click, a quiet rebellion. She imagined her father's voice guiding her, reminding her that truth could always be proven if you followed the numbers carefully enough. She worked quickly, wiping surfaces as she went, making sure the offices looked untouched. She kept the ledger in her bag, ready to compare later, but even without it, she knew what she was seeing. $50 million had not slipped through careless mistakes. It had been siphoned away by men who laughed at her while they stole from the company that trusted them. She left the office with her cart, her face calm, though her heart raced. She had proof now, real proof, pages of evidence that showed the truth. Her phone buzzed as the images saved, each one a weapon waiting for the right moment. She pressed her palm against her bag, feeling the outline of the ledger, and whispered to herself that the fight was no longer about staying invisible. It was about making sure their lies were exposed, no matter the cost. The morning sun cut through thin curtains in the small apartment, casting pale lines across the floor where Isabella's mother sat in her chair, her frail hands folded in her lap. The knock on the door was sharp, impatient, and when Isabella opened it, the landlord stood there, a folded paper in his hand, and no trace of sympathy in his eyes. He taped it to the frame without a word, the sound of the adhesive tearing louder than any shout. Isabella pulled it free with shaking fingers and read the words she had dreaded. Final notice. 48 hours until eviction. The paper crumpled slightly in her grip as her mother's voice rose weakly from the chair behind her, asking what it was, though Isabella forced a smile and said it was nothing urgent. But the truth sat heavy in her chest, pressing down until her breath caught. She laid the notice on the small kitchen table, beside her father's ledger, its leather worn but steady. The figures inside told their own story, a record of sacrifice, of months spent balancing groceries against medicine, light bills against rent. The math never lied, and this math was clear. Without thousands of dollars in 2 days, they would lose everything. Not just the roof, but the fragile stability her mother's health demanded. She thought of the hospital visits, the prescriptions stacked in bottles on the counter, the way her mother's breath came shallow at night. Homelessness would not just be hardship, it would be disaster. Her mind flashed back to the conference room, to the $50 million that Derek shouted about, the missing money that had thrown the company into panic. $50 million. Enough to pay hundreds of families their wages, enough to keep businesses alive, enough to wipe out her father's debt and secure her mother's care forever. The numbers swirled in her head, dizzying in their scale. That money existed. She had seen the contracts, had photographed the proof. It was out there, hidden in shell companies, feeding the greed of men who laughed while workers like her barely survived. The weight of that truth pressed harder than the eviction notice, because it was not just her own family hanging on the edge, but countless others who would never know why their jobs vanished or why their paychecks shrank. She sat at the table and opened the ledger, running her hand over the neat lines her father had drawn. He had always taught her that numbers were not abstract, they were lives, each figure tied to someone's meal, someone's medicine, someone's home. Now she saw it more clearly than ever. Derek's theft was not just betrayal of a company, it was betrayal of families like hers, of people who had no chance to fight back. She pressed her phone beside the ledger, scrolling through the photos of invoices and contracts, each image a silent cry for justice. The clock ticked in the corner, every second a reminder of the countdown. 48 hours until the locks changed, until her mother's chair was pushed into the street. Isabella clenched her jaw, her fury cooling into something sharper. She could not allow them to take everything, not when the truth sat in her hands. The men in suits thought she was powerless, but the ledger, the photos, and her mind told a different story. The numbers were on her side, and numbers did not lie. The week dragged on with meetings that spilled late into the night, and Isabella worked her usual shift with the same quiet rhythm, pushing her cart past glass doors, polishing surfaces until they gleamed. Yet her heart pounded heavier each day. The eviction notice burned into her mind like a clock counting down, and the evidence on her phone felt like both a shield and a target. She carried her father's ledger in her bag as always, its presence steadying her when doubt crept close, but she never noticed how often Derek's sharp eyes followed her movements. He had begun to linger in hallways when she passed, his gaze not mocking this time but calculating, like a man trying to solve a puzzle he had not expected to find. Late one evening, she left her cart near the supply closet while she emptied bins down the hall. When she returned, the bag she kept tucked beneath the cart looked slightly shifted, the zipper not aligned the way she remembered. Her stomach clenched as she pulled it open. The ledger was gone. Panic surged through her veins, cold and sharp, as she searched frantically under cloths and spray bottles, but it was useless. Someone had taken it, and she already knew who. The next morning, the summons came. HR called her into a narrow office with pale walls and thin blinds that let in strips of harsh light. Derek sat there with two managers beside him, arms crossed, his expression smooth as polished marble. On the desk lay her ledger, closed, its cover foreign in this setting. The head of HR, a woman with glasses perched low on her nose, folded her hands and spoke in a voice meant to sound calm but sharpened with suspicion. "Mr. Harlow has raised serious concerns," she said. "He found this book in your possession. It appears to contain company financial figures. Can you explain why a member of the cleaning staff would have such sensitive material?" Isabella's breath caught. Her fingers curled against her knees as she forced herself to keep her tone even. "That ledger is mine. It belonged to my father. Those numbers are personal, not company records." Derek leaned forward then, the corners of his mouth lifting in a cold smile. "Strange coincidence, isn't it?" he said. "That her so-called personal notes align with confidential discussions from our boardroom. Almost like she's been spying, maybe even passing information outside." The accusation hung in the air, poisonous and deliberate. The HR manager adjusted her glasses and sighed. "Given the seriousness of these claims, we must issue a formal warning. Further investigation will continue, but for now you are required to stay away from executive files and avoid unnecessary contact with management." Isabella's cheeks burned, her pulse hammering in her ears. A warning meant a permanent mark on her record, a shadow that could be used against her at any time. Derek leaned back, satisfied, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk, as if to remind her that he had taken her weapon and turned it into evidence against her. She left the office with her head high, but inside, fury twisted tight. They had stripped her of her father's gift, stolen the compass that had guided her, and painted her as a thief. Yet the truth lived in her memory, in the photos on her phone, in every figure she had already copied. Derek thought he had cornered her, but he had only shown how far he was willing to go. She walked back to her cart, hands steady on the handle, telling herself that numbers did not lie, and that sooner or later, his lies would collapse under their own weight. The warning notice sat heavy in Isabella's locker, the folded paper like a brand that marked her as guilty, even though she had done nothing wrong. Every time she opened the metal door, its sharp edges caught her eye, reminding her that Derek had stolen her father's ledger and twisted it into a weapon against her. She worked her shifts with a stiffness that burned through her arms and legs, her mind clouded with the thought of walking away. It would be easier to quit, easier to leave this place that treated her as disposable, easier to find another job scrubbing another floor. At least then she would not feel the weight of eyes judging her every move, waiting for her to make one mistake so they could cast her out. That night at home she sat in the dim kitchen, her mother asleep in the next room, the final eviction notice still taped to the fridge. The hum of the old appliance filled the silence while Isabella stared at the papers spread across the table, the photographs of contracts and invoices glowing faintly on her phone screen. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled through them, the evidence of theft clear in every line, yet doubt gnawed at her. What chance did she have against men in tailored suits, who commanded boardrooms and shaped narratives to their will? She was a cleaner, invisible to them except when mocked, a young woman with no degree, no allies, no shield against the ruin they could summon with a word. Her hand brushed against the empty space where the ledger should have been. She could still remember the feel of its worn cover, the faint scent of leather, her father's neat handwriting guiding her through columns of truth. The loss cut deeper than the warning slip, deeper even than the eviction threat. It was like losing him a second time. She buried her face in her hands, the thought of quitting pulling her closer with every passing minute. Then his voice rose in her memory, steady and calm as it had always been. Numbers don't lie. The words echoed until they filled the silence, until they steadied her pulse. Numbers didn't lie, but people did, and those lies were destroying not only her family, but hundreds of others who depended on honest wages. Derek and his allies were not only stealing millions, they were hiding behind the chaos, ready to sacrifice jobs to cover their trail. The thought struck her like lightning. If she walked away, the theft would continue, workers would lose their pay, families would be pushed into the same desperation she faced now. She lifted her head slowly, the decision forming with clarity that pushed back her fear. She could not quit. She could not stay silent. She would not only fight for her own survival, she would expose everything, the theft, the lies, the arrogance that believed no one could see through their fraud. She pressed her hand against her chest, steadying her breath, then gathered the photos on her phone and stacked them neatly with her notes. She was still invisible to them, but not for long. Soon she would make them see, and when they did, there would be no turning back. The boardroom was tense, the kind of silence that trembled with nerves and ambition. Heavy curtains blocked the morning sun, leaving the polished table bathed in the harsh glow of overhead lights. Men and women in tailored suits sat rigid in their chairs, waiting for answers that had been promised but not yet delivered. At the head of the table, Derek stood tall, papers spread neatly before him, his voice smooth and confident as he launched into his presentation. He spoke of balance sheets, projections, and recovery strategies, his tone carrying the authority of a man who believed he had outsmarted everyone in the room. Charts glowed on the screen behind him, lines that bent upward, numbers that promised stability. To the untrained eye, it looked convincing, a solution that would calm investors and save the company from collapse. But Isabella, moving quietly along the room's edge with her cart, saw the flaws instantly. She wore her usual uniform, head bowed as though focused only on dusting and polishing, but her eyes caught each figure that flashed across the screen. She could see the gaps he had hidden, the revenue inflated by false contracts, the losses disguised as assets, the shell companies buried deep in the notes no one else had the patience to read. He was presenting theft as salvation, a masterpiece of deception wrapped in financial jargon. And the board was listening, nodding slowly, desperate for something that would save them. Her heart pounded as she pushed the cart closer to the long table. Inside her bag, tucked carefully beneath folded rags, lay her father's ledger. She had retrieved it days earlier, finding the courage to demand it back from HR under the pretense of it being sentimental property, but now it felt heavier than ever. Its worn cover pressed against her ribs like a heartbeat, reminding her of the promise she had made not to quit, not to let lies stand unchallenged. Derek's voice carried on, confident and smug, as he pointed to another chart that showed the supposed recovery of $50 million. Isabella's lips tightened. She knew that money wasn't recovered at all. It was stolen, hidden away, waiting in accounts that Derek and his allies controlled. She wiped the same stretch of table over and over, listening as the CEO leaned forward, his expression easing with relief. "If these figures are accurate, we may have a chance to stabilize," he said. The board murmured in agreement, some even smiling, clinging to Derek's false promises. Isabella felt her breath catch, fury rising in her chest, but she forced her hands to remain steady. She could not speak yet. Timing was everything. If she interrupted too soon, they would dismiss her as a foolish cleaner trying to play hero. She had to wait for the moment when truth would break through their blindness. She moved to the corner of the room, where her father's ledger was within reach. Her hand brushed over the worn leather cover, grounding herself in its weight. Derek turned another page in his report, his ring tapping against the paper as if marking victory. Isabella looked at the faces around the table, saw how eager they were to believe, and knew this was the trap. He had spun a web so tight that no one else could see the holes, but she could. She had the proof, she had the numbers, and soon, when the moment came, she would use her father's ledger to tear down every lie in front of them all. The numbers flickered on the screen as Derek spoke, his voice confident but rushed, the words spilling faster, as if he feared silence might let someone question him. He tapped a column with his marker, circling it in red. "Here we have projected profit," he declared, "38.4 million, a clear indicator of recovery if we proceed with my plan." Some even nodding, as though they could already see investors calming. Isabella's hands tightened around the cloth she held. Her breath caught in her chest. She knew the figure. She had studied it in her father's ledger. She had seen the invoices herself. It was not profit at all, it was loss hidden behind clever labeling, and the moment had finally come when silence would no longer protect her. "That column isn't profit," she said suddenly, her voice clear and steady despite the tremor in her chest. "It's loss, disguised as revenue." The words cut through the air like a blade. The room went still, the kind of stillness that carried weight, the sound of disbelief pressing against the walls. Derek froze, marker poised midair, his head snapping toward her as though he could not believe the cleaner had dared to speak. The CEO's eyes narrowed. "What did you just say?" Isabella stepped closer to the table, her cart rolling softly behind her. She set the cloth down, reached into her bag, and pulled out the ledger. Its leather cover caught the light, edges worn, pages thick with years of numbers. She flipped it open with practiced ease, turning to the page where she had written the corrected figures. "Here," she said, laying it flat on the polished wood. Her pencil marks aligned with the company's reports, her columns neat and exact, each one balanced against the chaos Derek had drawn on the screen. The 38.4 million is not gain. It is expenditure shifted to look like income. It creates the illusion of recovery, but it is a lie. The truth is right here. The board members leaned in, their eyes darting between her ledger and the reports. One of them adjusted his glasses, his brow furrowing as he followed her lines. Another whispered, "She's right," under his breath. Derek's face flushed dark, his confident smile slipping as cracks formed in his performance. "This is ridiculous," he barked, slamming the marker down. "She's a cleaner. She doesn't understand what she's talking about." But Isabella did not falter. She tapped the ledger again, her father's handwriting in the margins, a quiet reminder of the truth she carried. "Numbers don't lie," she said firmly. "If you compare the invoices to these totals, you'll see the money has not returned. It has been siphoned away." The silence that followed was heavier than before. The kind of silence that spoke of realization dawning, of walls beginning to crumble. The CEO looked from Derek to Isabella, his eyes calculating, suspicion rising. For the first time since she started scrubbing their floors, Isabella was no longer invisible. She stood with her father's ledger open before the board, the truth shining from its pages, and the room could no longer pretend not to see her. All eyes in the boardroom followed Isabella as she straightened her shoulders and reached into her bag again, her breath steady, though her heart hammered inside her chest. The ledger lay open on the table, its familiar lines anchoring her courage, but she knew she needed more than words to tear down Derek's lies. Slowly she pulled out a thin stack of printed pages, careful not to let her hands tremble, and laid them across the polished surface one by one. "These are copies of the contracts and invoices I found," she said, her voice even but firm. "And here are the balance sheets I created to match them against your official reports. Together they tell a story you cannot ignore." The board leaned forward, curious and skeptical, their eyes scanning the neat pages filled with figures. Isabella guided them carefully, her finger tracing the lines. "Here," she said, pointing to one contract with a supplier named Westlake Solutions. "This company does not exist beyond a mailing address. Payments listed total 3.9 million, yet no goods were delivered." She slid the next page forward, and here, signed under another name, Bright Shore Consulting. 2.8 million transferred, again with no services rendered. Both connect back to the same bank routing number, hidden under different accounts. And reasons don't. She opened her balance sheets, the pencil marks sharp and precise, every column reconciled against the company's official records. If you follow the numbers, you will see that in the last quarter alone, 12.7 million has been siphoned away. And all of it flows into accounts linked to Derek Harlow. Gasps filled the room, the sound of disbelief shattering the silence. One board member leaned back in his chair, his face pale. Another turned sharply toward Derek, eyes wide with suspicion. Derek pushed back his chair, his voice rising, strained now rather than confident. "This is fabricated," he snapped. "She's a cleaner with no authority, no credentials, nothing but lies she's made up to discredit me." But his voice cracked on the last word, and Isabella held his gaze without flinching. She turned another page, showing side-by-side comparisons. "Look here," she said softly. "The revenue Derek claimed yesterday is actually these payments, shuffled into another column to look like profit. But when you strip away the false labels, it is money stolen from this company." The CEO rose slowly from his chair, his face unreadable as he studied the evidence. He lifted one of the contracts, then another, his eyes narrowing. "These signatures," he muttered, "they all trace back to the same initials." His voice was low, but the weight of it filled the room. The board exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier relief curdling into anger. Isabella laid her final sheet on the table, her handwriting neat, her columns balanced to the last decimal. 12.7 million, she said again, calm and certain. Not an error, not an accident. Theft. The word landed with finality. Derek stood rigid, his jaw tight, but the power he once held in the room was slipping through his fingers. For the first time, Isabella saw fear in his eyes, and she knew the numbers had spoken louder than any voice could. The boardroom hung heavy with silence, the kind that follows a storm when no one yet knows what has survived. Isabella stood at the far end of the table, her father's ledger open before her, its worn pages glowing under the harsh lights. The contracts and balance sheets she had laid down told a story too clear to deny. 12.7 million siphoned away, with signatures and schemes bold enough to collapse the company if left unchecked. The CEO stared at the evidence for a long moment, his face unreadable, before lifting his gaze to Derek. "Explain this," he said, his voice low but sharp, the kind of tone that cut through excuses before they could form. Derek's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked around the table, searching for support, but the managers who had once laughed at his jokes now stared at the papers with pale faces. "It's a misunderstanding," he tried, his voice cracking. "She forged this. She must have planted." He stopped when the CEO slammed a hand on the table. "Enough. The documents line up with our accounts. This is not invention. This is theft." Gasps echoed around the room, some captured by the cameras positioned in the corners, recording every second for internal records. The CEO turned toward the others, his expression cold. "And you," he said, pointing at the two managers whose names appeared on the shell contracts. They shifted in their seats, sweat beading on their foreheads. "You signed off on fraudulent payments. You thought no one would notice while you lined your pockets." His voice rose. "You are finished here. Security will escort you out, and legal will follow." The men tried to protest, but their words stumbled into silence when guards appeared at the doorway. Derek rose to his feet, rage twisting his face, but the CEO's hand sliced through the air. "Don't speak. You've disgraced this company for the last time." Isabella stood motionless, her heart thundering as Derek and the others were led out, their shouts muffled against the closing door. The room remained still, only the quiet scratch of pens as board members signed immediate suspension orders breaking the silence. Then, the CEO turned back to Isabella. His eyes lingered on the open ledger, the numbers carefully balanced, the handwriting a mixture of her father's and her own. "Sit," he said. She hesitated, then pulled out a chair. "Correct the reports," he ordered. Her hands moved steadily, pencil sliding across paper, recalculating projections, aligning columns. The cameras caught every moment. Her calm posture, her clear focus, the old ledger beside her like an anchor. Where Derek had twisted numbers into lies, Isabella restored order, every line pulling the company back from the edge. The board watched in silence, stunned as a young woman in a cleaner's uniform pieced together what their executives had failed to see. When she looked up at last, the CEO nodded. "The crisis is over," he said, though his voice carried more respect than relief. Isabella closed the ledger softly, her father's words echoing in her heart. Numbers don't lie. And neither did she. 6 months later, the office looked different, brighter somehow, though the walls and windows were the same. Isabella sat behind a desk of polished walnut that stretched wide and steady, sunlight spilling across papers stacked in neat rows. On the corner, in a frame of clear glass, rested her father's leather ledger, its worn cover preserved like a relic, the pages turned to one of his last entries. She looked at it often, a reminder that truth could survive, even when everything else seemed fragile. The nameplate at the front of her desk read, "Director of Compliance," bold letters that still startled her each morning, a title she had earned not through favors or connections, but through persistence and proof. The numbers told their own story. Profit growth had risen 34% in 2 quarters, a record the company had never touched before. Employee retention, once a problem hidden behind endless turnover, now stood 25% higher thanks to reform she had demanded. She had written policies that required transparency in contracts, open channels for whistleblowers, and closed loopholes that had allowed theft to flourish. The changes had not only restored trust among investors but given employees a reason to stay, to believe that fairness mattered as much as profit. Her office phone rang with steady rhythm these days, calls from partners and auditors, but one reminder always glowed brightest on her calendar. The Cruz Scholarship, named for her father, funded through her insistence at board meetings, already helping working-class students chase degrees in finance. She thought of the girl she had been at 18, forced to leave school for bills that could not wait, and she imagined how different her life might have been if such a hand had been offered. Now, she was the one extending it, giving others the chance she had lost. Each month, when the first group of scholarship recipients sent thank you letters, she read them all, seeing pieces of her own story reflected in their words. The boardroom had changed too, where once she had entered invisible, cloth in hand, head lowered against mocking laughter, now chairs scraped back in respect as she walked in. Board members rose when she arrived, their nods solemn, their eyes sharp with attention. They called her Miss Cruz, their voices edged with deference, the same men and women who had once looked straight through her as if she were part of the furniture. The shift was not built on pity but on results no one could deny. Even the CEO, who had doubted her and nearly dismissed her, spoke with a tone touched by reluctant admiration. In the last meeting he had said her perspective had saved the company, a phrase wrapped in corporate language but carrying truth underneath. Isabella listened, smiled politely, and thought of her father's voice saying numbers don't lie. She carried that truth with her now, no longer a secret, no longer a hidden strength. As she closed her laptop and prepared to enter another board session, her eyes lingered on the framed ledger. It was more than memory. It was legacy, proof that what once seemed small could outlast every attempt to silence it. When she rose, the boardroom would rise with her, and this time, she was ready. If this story moved you, like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.